My name is Elisabeth Hendrickson. So we're here today to talk about robot framework through the lens of history. When Pekka approached me to do this talk, I thought that it would be a really lovely opportunity to revisit 25 years or so of my personal history, my professional history. And it was a lot of fun to go through my archives and dig stuff up that honestly, some of the stuff I dug up, I thought I'd lost long ago. More importantly, I thought it was a good opportunity to highlight some history that maybe not everybody would know about people and events that were really influential in getting our industry to where it is today. So then the question was, well, where should I start the story? I could tell a nice linear story, 25 years of history, my beginning, which obviously isn't the beginning of test automation in general. My history with test automation only really goes back to about 1995, 96, something like that. The industry has been around a lot longer than that. And as long as there's been software development, there's been software test automation. Jerry Weinberg used to talk about doing test-driven development on the Mercury project way back in the day. So, but I could start my story at the beginning. But then I realized that maybe it would make more sense to start my story with Hello World, with the point of time when I first actually put my hands on robot framework. So I take you back to a bar. The year is 2007. It is October 2007, and the place is Portland, Oregon, more specifically McMenamin's Kennedy School. This is the site of the very first Agile Alliance functional testing tools workshop. We'll talk more about those workshops in a bit, but we were all gathered there. Pekka was there, Juha was there, I was there. We were all there for the workshop, and we had agreed that as long as we were all in the same place together, that we would take this opportunity to work together to get my laptop set up to run Robot Framework. Now, at the time, Robot Framework was not open sourced. That wouldn't happen until 2008. However, we were all working for the same, doing some work for the same company, and I was teaching classes and running workshops within the company. And although I was not going to be teaching Robot Framework, there was a general agreement that the more I knew about the test automation framework that was being used, the better I would be able to bring that context into what I was doing with the company. So this was something that we all agreed was a good idea for the company. I also honestly was kind of excited to learn Robot Framework. However, it had been a very busy past few days, and we had not had a chance to work together. And at this point, we were all kind of in a celebratory mood at the bar, and I was 2 beers in, and when Pekka came over and said, "So, when are we going to pair?" I had to say, I think this is just one thing that's not going to happen. We're not going to have time, because, we're all enjoying the party now, and I should have known. Pekka could be very driven. And so he said, no, we have time. We have time now. I'll get you another beer. You get out your laptop. So that's how I found myself at the bar pairing with Pekka. And I think pairing with Pekka, it might have been with Juha, but getting Robot Framework set up on my laptop, beer in hand, and writing my first Hello World in Robot Framework. And of course, as time went by, I really genuinely learned to appreciate so much about the design of Robot Framework. Just from the very beginning, the concept of the architecture was absolutely incredible. And we'll talk about how the influence of these workshops, I think, contributed to the tremendous framework and community that Robot Framework now has. So, however, to put all of this in context, we do need to go back in time to a very, very different time in our industry's history. flashback to 1996. Behold, a cubicle from 96. This is not actually my cubicle. I don't have a picture of the office that I was in at the time. I found this one online, and honestly, I had such a flash of recognition because even the color of the panels, I think, is the same as the furniture that we had at the office that I was in. The same desk, same everything. This was basically what my cubicle looked like at the time. This was in a software company, relatively small startup, scrappy little startup that made enterprise software. We had what was at the time a very typical software development process. We were doing major annual releases. We had a completely separate QA organization that had a reporting structure completely separate from development. So the head of development and the head of QA were essentially peers in the organization. And we followed what we believe to be best practices with respect to our quality assurance process. As was true with many companies at that time, though, we did have a pretty big problem, which was that there was an overwhelming amount of stuff to test. We were operating mostly manually. Vast majority of what we did was manual test script execution. And it took weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to qualify any release. And of course, during that time, we're finding bugs. And so we're all playing whack-a-bug and schedules would get blown out. It was the usual kinds of terrible stories that you hear. Ultimately, we did decide that test automation would be a way that we could potentially address the combinatoric explosion problem. Now, what I mean by that is our architecture was at the time dubbed a client-server open architecture. And what that meant was that we had a thick client that ran on a machine like a PC or a Macintosh. I believe that we supported Mac, DOS, and Windows at the time. And it would have been Windows 95, I think. Anyway, so we had these clients, and we had to test all the clients, but then at the back end, we could support any of a number of major database flavors, Sybase, Oracle, I forget what else. Plus we supported major networks like Banyan Vines and Novell, and I don't remember. Anyway, when you mapped it all out, it was basically this combinatorics problem of the Win95 client with the Sybase database and this driver and that network, and it was huge. Even if we did some analysis and determined, well, these two things don't actually affect each other, so we just have to make sure that we test it just once, we still ended up with a massive matrix of all of the combinations that we had to test. And that was just the combinations. That wasn't the tests themselves. Then we also had to actually execute all of those tests. And since we were doing the same tests over and over and over again, we did decide that test automation would probably help. And this is how I found myself as the team lead for the test automation team. And there were, I believe, 4 of us. Now, here's the thing about the state of the world with respect to test automation at that time. The typical way that you would do this is to purchase one of the various tools that were on the market. There were a bunch of them, and all the tools basically made the same promises. We did try a couple of different ones. It doesn't matter which ones we tried because the key thing is that they were all vendor tools that were expensive, that had a hamstrung vendor script language as the programming language for the thing. But the theory was that you wouldn't have to do very much of that because you were going to record and playback. That was the theory. And so all of the vendors in this space were pretty much promising magic. They were pitching their product as something that was so easy to use. It could be used by non-technical people. And by the way, I absolutely loathe it when anyone describes people by what they aren't as opposed to what they are. But that was how this was pitched, that you could have a relatively low skilled group of QA people who would be able to take these tools and get test automation for free as a side effect of doing their normal testing stuff and just recording as they went. This, of course, didn't work. We figured out fairly quickly that was not gonna work and that test automation was programming. But we still had a very small number of people who had licenses because the licenses were so expensive. So I think we had 4 people doing test automation. So we had 4, maybe 5 licenses. Because the thing that you can't see in this picture, you have to picture what would have been behind me if this is where I sat in my cubicle. Behind me was a folding table that had a bunch of computers lined up. Because remember, this is 1996, so the cloud was not a thing. Virtualization was not a thing. In order to run the test automation, we needed actual physical computers to run it on. If you left the monitor actually like turned on, you would see it took over your computer. And so you would see the windows flashing and the data getting entered very, very fast. It was actually very exciting and somewhat entertaining to watch. In fact, it was, side note, so exciting and so entertaining to watch that it became a tour stop on the CEO's regular customer prospect tours. He'd come by, he loved to tour prospective customers around the building to see the different groups work. He would take them to the developers area and they would get to watch the developers work. And then he would take them to various other areas, to the QA area, get to watch the QA people test. And on one such visit, he saw these things happening in the test automation lab, which again, folding tables right behind my cubicle. And I got to give a little song and dance, and he got to talk about how much we invested in quality. Very impressive to prospective customers. The thing about being a small, scrappy startup, though, is that you typically are looking to save money wherever you can. And in this particular case, one of the places where the company sought to save money was on not buying too much equipment. And so consequently, as we grew as a company and we hired more QA people, we would put in the requisitions for, hey, let's buy another computer because new person's starting. And on too many occasions, we were told, no, you have plenty of computers, figure it out, make it work. And so, of course, we were pilfering from the test automation lab, which incidentally, we had pilfered from various places, older computers that weren't being used to fill up the lab. So it's not unusual in this case, it was not unusual for machines to get pilfered. So we were pilfering. It started with 4 machines, then 3 machines, and then 2 machines. And I think it probably was on the day that I had taken the last machine out of the lab and handed it off to a new QA person who started, that the CEO came by with his little tour group to show off the test automation lab and the investment we're making in quality. And he turned to me and he said, "Where are the machines? What did you do?" And it was all I could do to keep from saying to him, "Hey, you know those purchase orders you wouldn't sign? Guess what?" I didn't do that, though. These were customers, and that would not have been the done thing. So I don't remember exactly what I said or exactly what I did, but I probably gave a demo on my machine of the things moving very quickly and entertainingly. In any case, I digress. So this was the state of the world in 96. Heavyweight software development processes, heavyweight test automation tools. And honestly, while we had some success, there was a lot of frustration. That just so often when the test automation broke, it had nothing to do with the software under test, or at least it wasn't telling us anything interesting about the software under test. It was the maintenance burden of fragile test automation. They took a long time to run. They weren't providing good information. They required a massive investment. And there was such a long feedback loop. The developers would change stuff and not even realize that they were breaking the test automation because we couldn't afford to buy licenses for them so that they could run the automated tests. And so it just became untenable. And honestly, while we had some successes, I would not overall say that we were wildly successful. And I ended up very frustrated and jaded and cynical. It was at about this time that what I didn't know was that there was a whole rebellion brewing. So I found out about this, though, in 1997. I went to a conference, and I accidentally met up with Kem Kainer. I didn't know who he was at the time. We were both filing out of a plenary session, and we were closely proximate to each other, and he struck up a conversation with me. I did ask him later, why me of all the people? Like, why talk to me? And he said, oh, well, I was really curious because that session was so awful, but you were scribbling notes frantically. I wanted to know what you got out of the session that I didn't. And of course, I had to admit to him that what I was doing was because I was trapped in this seat, and in this large audience, there was no good way out. And I was listening to this thing that made me so angry. I was taking notes on everything that made me angry as my way of dealing with being in this situation. So I did tell him that. I no longer remember what the topic of the talk was, or who was speaking, or why I was angry. But it led to that great accidental meeting with Kem Kainer. And as he and I were talking about our experiences in the industry, we kind of bonded, and we talked about test automation. He shared with me that there had been a group of people. He said, that's funny, a group that just met a few months ago to talk about frustrations with vendors and vendors that overpromise and tools that underdeliver, and share experiences to get beyond the vendor hype. Well, what I didn't know at the time was that was the very first Los Altos workshop on software testing. And he also forwarded to me a couple of papers that had come out of that. One of those was his paper on maintainable test automation, where he explicitly called out that test automation is programming. And James Box, incredibly well written test automation snake oil paper. It was a little bit more incendiary than Kem Kainer's paper, but laid out such incredibly insightful points about why the vendor hype the tools do not live up to the promise. So as I read these, I realized I've found my people. And I ended up becoming involved in the Los Altos workshop on software testing. There were, I think 17 or 18 meetings of Lost. I did love the joke, Lost weekends. We held them on weekends. They all had roughly the same format, although certainly the exact details evolved over time, and as we collectively got better and better and better at the format for these meetings. The basic structure remained consistent in that it was a relatively small group of people, 12 to 18 people, give or take. Small enough that you could have incredibly deep conversations. It wasn't a conference in the sense that there's a speaker and there's tracks. It was instead entirely peer-driven and grounded in experience reports. And so the general format would be somebody would give an experience report, and the rest of the folks would ask questions and challenge their thinking and challenge each other and have a discussion and extract absolutely as much insight as possible out of that person's experience. And then somebody else would go and do an experience report. And one of the things that made the format utterly brilliant and that Kem Kainer absolutely deserves 100% credit for was the intellectual property agreements for the material that came out of those workshops. It explicitly says in the handbook that there's no official minutes that come out of these meetings. There's no official record. Instead, anybody who's there is welcome to publish whatever they would like. There are rules for attribution. If you're talking about someone else's invention, you don't ever claim it as your own. And if you talk about what happened at the meeting, you have to cite everybody who was at the meeting. But the explicit rules actively encouraged publishing, because part of the whole idea was to distill as much insight as possible in these group settings. And so a lot of conference talks and articles and papers came out of LOST meetings. It wasn't just LOST, though. The thing is, LOST was such an absolutely brilliant structure, gave rise to a bunch more kind of like LOST, each with its own particular quirks or ways of operating, but with that same sense of relatively small group of people, incredible conversations, and huge amounts of insight and knowledge and publications coming out of it. This community does love some acronyms, so they're all acronyms. WOPR is the Workshop on Performance and Reliability. STEAMER, the Software Test Managers Roundtable. WET is the Workshop on Heuristics and Exploratory Testing. LOOT is the London Exploratory Workshop on Testing. And AAFTT. AAFTT has a very special place in this story. AAFTT is the Austin Workshop on Test Automation. But the key thing is that this rich set of incredible peer-driven conferences allowed for so much knowledge sharing. It really advanced the state of the industry at the time. And I'm sure that there are more that either I am not aware of or that I am forgetting to mention. But LOST really did spawn an incredible number of similar kinds of community events. All right, so that was the rebellion. But now let's talk about kind of what happened next in the industry. The rise of OSS, open source tools. A couple things were happening at the same time. So this is in the early 2000s. One thing that was happening was the rise of Agile. So the Agile Manifesto was published in 2001. It was not the beginning of Agile. Some people kind of point to it and say, well, that was the beginning. Actually, the beginning had been brewing for, frankly, years and years. And there's a long history that involves the patterns community and the small talk community and various other communities that contributed to the place where we kind of might look at and say, well, that's the start of Agile. The Agile Manifesto had brought together a group of people who at the time were practicing lightweight software development approaches that flew in the face of those best practices that we had been using in 1996. The end result of that gathering at Snowbird was the Agile Manifesto, a distillation of very high-level principles that defined what Agile was, contrasted with what at the time was considered best practice. Agile really gained traction from that point forward, from 2001 forward. And with that, it created a different context in which the very heavyweight specialized commercial vendor tools didn't, frankly, make as much sense. In a world where instead of a strict separation of QA and development, and instead, co-located cross-functional teams that have all the skills that you need to release software, having specialized tools that only a small percentage of the people on that team would be able to have access to or know how to use, no longer made sense. Furthermore, programmers were, frankly, getting a lot more into finding ways to automate tests than perhaps they had been doing in 1996. So I think it's important to note that developers have always tested, and anybody who thinks that developers don't test, that's just flat out not true. But what was true is that there wasn't a whole lot of test frameworks available for the popular languages of the day that made it easy to write tests. But that started changing. With, I believe it was 1999 when Kent Beck came out with JUnit. And the various XUnit family of unit testing tools, they're grounded back in SUnit days, but they still were massive leaps and bounds forward for unit testing for developers. So on these Agile teams, now you've got tools that are designed to make it easy for developers to write tests. And so the dynamics start to shift. Furthermore, when you've got these integrated teams, having ways of tightly bringing together the code that's going to drive the application and the expression of the expectations, that became all the more important. And we start to see that with FIT. Ward Cunningham came out with FIT in 2003. And fitness followed closely after. With FIT, you would have your HTML file with tables that had an expression of natural language expectations, and then that would connect with fixtures to code that would talk to or drive the underlying application code. And Fitness did that, but with a wiki. Kind of ironic that the person who invented wikis used. Anyway, doesn't matter. You also are seeing water and selenium drivers for web applications. And then Cucumber had a different approach than Fit. Same idea of being able to express expectations in natural language. However, instead of tabular, being able to express in terms of given condition, when, event, then, expectation, it was a different way of expressing ideas. And so we start to see these tools that are really designed around encouraging collaboration, designed around the idea of blended teams and tight feedback loops. And there were so many other tools that were all exploding at this same time. It was a Cambrian explosion of tools in the early 2000s. Absolutely amazing explosion of tools. Now, I mentioned AAFTT plays a special role in this. So the Austin Workshop on Test Automation, the person who started it, Brett Petticord, he's one of the people who created Water, web testing in Ruby. He had been partnering closely. Oh, here's Kem Kainer. So Kem Kainer created Lost. And Brett had been partnering closely with Brian Merrick, who had been really promoting Ruby as a language for testers, a scripting language for testers. And so Brett and Brian had a class that they created, and I believe that Water had come out of work that they had done in the class, contributions from many other people. But AAFTT became a place where we could talk about things like Water, so it was a little bit more from the tester community. There was at the time this really interesting kind of thing happening with the Agile community and the context-driven test community. And so this was more likely to be from that perspective of testers, but testers, like pure, straight up, separate QA kinds of testers, that's not the culture that we had here. Instead, it was a bringing together of people, like-minded people from all different perspectives, from the perspective of testing and from the perspective of development. And so you see Ward Cunningham here at AAFTT 4. So the Austin Workshop on Test Automation, much like Lost before it, really created this place for an incredible sharing of knowledge and perspectives that led to amazing steps forward, innovation, tool adoption. It also led Ryan Wilcox, by the way, worked for ThoughtWorks at the time. He did what I first time I ever saw Selenium demoed at AAFTT 6. it was a place for people to come together and talk about tools. Rob Mee had joined AAFTT number 4 to talk about domain-specific languages. He was the founder of Pivotal Labs. It was not yet called Pivotal Labs, but the company existed. And that ended up being a professional connection that had a massive impact on my career personally. And so these workshops became places where not just shared knowledge, but also ended up affecting people's careers rather drastically. I ended up doing a few contracts for Pivotal Labs and then ultimately eventually joined Pivotal Labs full-time right before it was spun out as the company Pivotal, and I spent 7 years there. So all of that came about thanks to one particular AAFTT meeting. Anyway. So AAFTT had given me this perspective on workshops for sharing information about tools, for doing demos and having discussions and talking about trade-offs and approaches to doing things. So the next thing, though, that brings us to the Agile Alliance Functional Testing Tools group, which is really, I think, when Pekka asked me to do this talk, he was thinking about how influential that program was. It was not a long-lived program. I think we had a total of maybe 5 meetings, but it had a huge impact for such a small program. And it's worth talking about how it came to be. Janita Andrea is the reason that the Agile Alliance Functional Testing Tools program existed. And she's the reason that it got funding. And she deserves all of the credit for its existence. She had a vision. She talked to me about the vision. She noted that in the industry, IDEs had come so far in 10 years. It was incredible. As a programmer, you now had automated support for massive refactorings. You had IntelliSense and with command completion and incredible tools at your fingertips. And when it came to test automation, with things like Fit or any of a number of other tools, Cucumber, the tooling was incredible. But you still were expressing expectations in natural language, and there was no tool that really did a good job of making that connection between the expression of intent and the underlying code. And she recognized this as a severe limitation. It resulted in it being so much more difficult for a business analyst to edit the expectations directly. And she believed that things could be better. And she had a vision for that future. And then the question is, well, how to achieve that? And so as we talked, and I reflected on my own experience with Lost and with AAFTT, I suggested, well, there are a lot of tool makers. And what if we got them all together and had really deep, rich conversations about the state of tools and what we wish were true? So bringing together not just tool makers, but also the people who would benefit from the tools. And we started with one workshop. So we got funding because it was an Agile Alliance funded program. And we used that funding to provide travel stipends to make it possible for people to attend. And we brought together a bunch of folks in Portland, Oregon in October 2007, which is why I ended up in that bar, 2 beers in and pairing on Robot Framework. But during that first meeting, we had all these people sharing their perspectives. Let's look at who was there. Of course, there was Janita. And here's Pekka Clark, who, of course, you're going to recognize. And I believe that's Juha. It's a little hard to tell because the picture is so grainy, but I'm pretty sure that that's Juha. Here's Ward Cunningham and Brian Merrick. And here's somebody you might not know how Sauce Labs came about, but John Dunham at the time, serial entrepreneur, not necessarily really steeped in the test automation space, but very committed to the idea that open source was definitely going to be his next thing. He was going to do something in the open source space, and absolutely intrigued by what was going on. And so he came, and although he did not meet his co-founders at this meeting, I believe, it was through the connections through this community that led to the founding of Sauce Labs. So another example of these kinds of workshops leading to fairly big change. And here's another one. So this was at the second meeting in Toronto, and Andrew Clay Schaefer, he was there. Now, funny story. So I later met up with Andrew Clay Schaefer at, I thought I was meeting him for the first time at a DevOps conference. He gave a talk that I thought was utterly brilliant, and I stayed to talk to him about it. And he said, "Oh, you and I have met." We what now? He said, "Oh, you might not remember, but I was at that AAFTT meeting in Toronto. I stumbled on it, hadn't planned to be there. But I remember asking you, would this be the place to find people who would be interested in test driving infrastructure, test driving the state of virtual machines?" He was, at the time, he was at Puppet Labs. He was one of the co-founders of Puppet Labs. And I did remember when, after he said that, I remembered the conversation, even though I didn't remember having met him before. And I remember saying, "Well, I don't know, but if there is anywhere here that you're going to find somebody interested in that, it's probably in this room. Come on in." So, overall, 5 meetings. The third meeting, I don't have good pictures from, but that meeting I think was probably particularly influential. Aslak Helisoy came, and I remember that there were fantastic conversations about capabilities that Robot Framework had, and that Cucumber had, and that Fit had, and the end result was saw this really interesting. After that ratcheting of capabilities, Robot Framework got given when then syntax. And I know that there were changes that went into Cucumber as a framework. And so it was through this incredible opportunity for people to come together and share their experiences, their ideas, their implementations, and that we saw such incredible growth in the capabilities of tools at the time. I did say I would tell you why I think Robot Framework is genius. So if we go back to that time in the bar where I was writing my first Hello World script, I could already see that there was so much there that I was really going to appreciate. And over the next several years, I used Robot Framework a lot. I think that probably the best illustration of the power of Robot Framework is in some work that I did for a company where there was an API and a command line interface and a web interface. And they needed to have automated regression tests. And I recognized an opportunity to express the expectations once. Because the expectations, it was a service that you put stuff in, you got stuff out. And what you put in and what you got out should be the same, regardless of whether you get that by curling an API endpoint or by clicking through a browser. The input, if you give it this input, you should get this output. And the thing about a tool like Robot Framework is that you can eliminate all of the incidental stuff that doesn't matter and distill out what really, really, really matters in terms of expectations. So you don't have to put in all of the click steps. You can extract all of that out and just express, if I put in this, I get out that. So I did. And we had one page that had the regression tests for the most important, if nothing else works, these things should be true. That then you could control execution for which of the different plugins. actually executed the tests at execution time. And so we had one artifact that represented the expectations and then configuration to point it at the correct thing with the pluggable architecture for the various plugins that would drive the appropriate interface. That capability is so far from anything that I could have imagined in 1996. It was utterly amazing, provided a huge amount of value for this particular company, and illustrates the things that I love most about Robot Framework. So being able to express expectations in natural language is so incredibly powerful. And it allows us to think about the essence of what we're building as opposed to the implementation details, separating the expectations from the implementation details, separating the what from the how. Has so much incredible power. And the fact that Robot Framework is flexible in how you express those expectations. There are some systems that lend themselves to very strict tabular formats, and there are others that lend themselves better to what Dale Emery would call a planned response system, where you've got given this condition, when event, then expectation. There's systems that just lend themselves so much better to that kind of expression. The wealth of plugins that allow you to test a heterogeneous distributed system make it incredibly powerful and adaptable for such a wide variety of systems. And then the third thing that I love about Robot Framework is the control of execution, the fact that you can tag your tests. And these days, back in 1996, we didn't have a build pipeline. We had a build, but there was no pipeline. There was build and then a QA phase. These days, it's very different. It's much more common to have an entire pipeline where it starts with a build and then some functional tests, but then there's probably a fan out that has a bunch of configurations or a bunch of platforms. And so being able to have the same set of tests that are all under source control in the same repository as the code, and that you can control which thing is executing at which place depending on tags, makes this an incredibly flexible framework for with respect to controlling execution. So these are primitives. These are building blocks that make Robot Framework incredibly adaptable. And is just frankly so many light years beyond where we were in 1996. And I hope that it's been valuable to you to hear about that entire journey as an industry that we've taken from that time to get to where we are now. Now what I find really interesting is looking ahead. Here we are in 2021, and the industry's changed so much in 25 years. And in some ways, I almost feel like now we're kind of back to the future. A really interesting thing is happening with the emphasis on low-code tools and low-code test automation. And we are at a fundamentally different place than we were in 96. And so I don't necessarily view this as the pendulum of history. Low code, lots of code, low code, lots of code. It's more like the spiral, and we're now in a fundamentally different context. And I think that it's going to be a really interesting adventure to see how Robot Framework and the community learns and grows and adapts given today's modern application development approaches and the new emphasis on low code things. This is going to be absolutely fascinating. Anyway, I think it's time for some question and answer. And thank you so much for your time.
Hey, Elisabeth, welcome to RoboCon.
Cool. Thank you so much. My microphone works, right?
Yes, everything's working fine. You're sounding great. Awesome. So, you know, you entered it on kind of like a cliffhanger to me. You said, we're going towards these low code things. It's interesting, but there was no like, is it the same thing? Has the technology actually fulfilled the promise of record and playback? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I confess I am not terribly optimistic that record and playback will ever really work well. But I think you were trying to ask an actual question, and I think I saw one in the chat about the future, and I think I interrupted your question.
No, that's fine. No, go ahead. So the question on the future was, where do you see the development and testing in the future?
That is an excellent question. I think that there's, one of the changes that I have seen over the course of the last 25 years is the rise of Agile that results in cross-functional teams where the team becomes the agent of work. And the team has everyone on it that is needed in order to deliver value. And I see that continuing to succeed. There are various places that have imperfectly implemented that. There are still challenges with people being assigned to multiple teams and multitasking. And so I'm not saying that we have somehow achieved this amazing place with rainbows and unicorns, but I do think that things are better now than they were. And I don't see us going back to a world with sharp separation. And yet at the same time, I also see so many things are changing about technology that they will force us to adapt again. So just the rise of AI, the rise of low-code platforms, those are examples of two types of technology that flat out didn't exist, or if they did not exist in the form that they exist today 10 years ago, and they open up brand new questions. How do you test your expectations on a platform that doesn't have all the level of control that you had? And it's a little bit analogous to going from a world of you're writing in assembly and you are literally controlling what the registers inside the computer do to you're writing in a super high level language like Python. There are things that change about how you think about testing and organizing yourselves to do work when you make a change like that. And then with AI, how do you test models that are constantly being retrained? I do think that you end up with a different set of a different context that we will end up continuing to learn how to adapt to effectively. And at the same time, I suspect that we will still be cursing out computers for doing exactly what they were programmed to do instead of what we intended. So that's one of those things that's going to be evergreen. That's kind of it for my prognostications for the future. I'm not a very good futurist.
Awesome. So next question's from Renee. Renee says, Elisabeth, awesome talk. Thanks. Can you say again in which year it was already clear that capture and playback was a stupid idea? Want to quote you with my customers.
I don't want to call it a stupid idea. Everyone wants to believe in magic. That doesn't mean magic will work.
Right.
But we had recognized in easily 96 that it was capture playback as it existed at the time was simply not going to work. And I think what's important is the why. Because it was literally just recording our actions with no understanding of the significance of those actions, it could never really result in scripts that expressed our intent. And that is a place where I see Robot Framework being utterly brilliant with giving you this way of expressing intent that is separate from all of the little details of what you're clicking on. And that's what you lose with capture playback. I have not seen anything that comes close to fixing that problem in 25 years.
How did you find out about all these groups before podcasts? I grew up around the same time. I was in the industry. No idea, but you're with all the cool kids learning everything. Was it the location? I'm just curious to know how that all worked out.
Well, it was just random luck that I happened to run into Kem Kainer at a 1,500 person conference. Oh. The odds of that are so low. And then that he would strike up a conversation with me, a complete stranger, and it was all because I was rapidly taking notes in a talk that he absolutely hated. And so that one connection led to me being part of the Lost community. And that led to me being part of these other communities. And as the communities spawned, we all were on the same mail lists. So, I mean, I guess if you weren't at a conference, the way that you would learn is the existence of such a thing was that there were all of these mail lists at the time. I don't know that that's what the cool kids do anymore, because these days we've got Slack and Discourse and who knows what.
Cool. Elisabeth, Manny wants to know, do exploratory testing and test automation go hand in hand to support each other?
Oh, you bet. Absolutely. There's nothing about exploratory testing that is inherently manual, and automation-assisted exploration can be incredibly powerful. I remember one example where it was one of the contracts I did for Pivotal Labs way back in the day. Pivotal Labs made Pivotal Tracker, and I was doing some exploratory testing for them right before they turned on the ability to take credit cards. They were very nervous about this. And so they wanted to bring in somebody who had not been up to their eyebrows, steeped in the thing, so that to get an external point of view. And I quickly realized that it was just such a pain in the butt to go through the steps to get to the point where I was going to put in a credit card. So I wrote a little bit of automation that ultimately got thrown away. I asked them, do you want this? I wrote it. You could keep it. And they said, no, we're good. So that's just one example where it really does go hand in hand. The other place it goes hand in hand is if all of the boring, repetitive stuff has been covered by automation, then that means that the stuff that's left to explore is really interesting.
Absolutely. Tristna wants to know, what is the hardest thing during your career as a QA?
Oh, I'm having flashbacks right now to the company where the company where I said I would never again take the title of Director of Quality Engineering. I ended up taking that title one more time, but in this case, this particular company, I could see the train wreck happening and had no organizational ability to stop it. And this was the company where we had these really long integration times. This is long before continuous integration was a thing, or if it was a thing, it was not something that there was language around. And I got in my head this idea that since the integration process we had was to have all the developers check in their stuff, and then we had a build person who went and did all of the compilation and the linking and produced the package that then got handed over to QA. And that process could take weeks because there would be these merge conflicts and stuff wouldn't compile together. And so this build person was like the human duct tape that was gluing together the package that then got handed off to QA. And I remember sitting down with the then director of engineering to say, it feels like we could maybe save some time what if instead of the there being this build person, what if instead the developers did a fresh get from the source control system and did a local merge and then compiled it all together so that they could catch the compile errors that were going to happen because they had messed with this DLL or whatever, and now things weren't going to compile together. What if they did that on their machine? And the director of engineering actually laughed me out of his office and said, that's not possible. This was 1999, by the way. It was in fact possible, but it was just not normal in the industry at the time. And that was the hardest thing, was being able to not even necessarily have the right vocabulary around improvements that I could see that we needed to make, but seeing that we could do this and having no ability to get it done. Oh,
I'm getting flashbacks because I've been there myself. That's funny. Next question's from Joshua. I don't know if there's anything good about COVID, but one thing I've seen a lot is a lot of more interest in accessibility testing. I guess because more people are online. But anyway, the question is, do you believe accessibility testing can truly be automated, including color blindness, etc.?
Well, that's a yes and answer. So there are things that we know about accessibility, and there are accessibility auditing tools that can tell you if your color contrast is not high enough, and can tell you, give you feedback about, aspects of the design for, do you have alt text for all of your images, etc. And so that piece can be automated. I think that I don't know how I would go about automating. What does this thing that we have built feel like to someone who is using a screen reader. So we can audit for the stuff, we can use automation to audit for the stuff that we know feels bad. But that doesn't mean that we will have identified in advance everything that could result in a suboptimal experience for someone who needs those accessibility features.
Absolutely. Ed has a question in Slido, and Ed wants to know, Elisabeth, when we think about test automation, we think work being done. But looking at your story, it seems just as important is the people doing the work. Would you say that it is important to focus on people as well as the work?
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's more important to focus on the people, because the people do the work. And so if it's an inhumane environment and people are burning out, then the work is not going to get done. So people are absolutely essential. Software is an inherently human-centered activity. Building software is an inherently human-centered activity. People matter so much.
Absolutely. So Elisabeth Pecker said, not a question, but huge thanks for a great talk and kind words. So kudos to you there. Next question from Stefan. Stefan says, Agile was developed for developers mostly and for developing processes, but testing really thrived in this environment. Do you think that adding more extra points to the Agile Manifesto centered around testing will make it flourish even more?
No. I have to explain, because that sounds really harsh. But I have to back up and explain. I believe that the Agile Manifesto is an artifact from a moment in time, and that it's not a living document in the sense that it's constantly being revised and represents a set of working agreements. I think that it reflects, and frankly, if you listen to the original signatories who wrote that manifesto at Snowbird at that ski trip. The fact that it got created at all is a minor miracle. It was really the result of basically two people saying, okay, we got to write some stuff down. Let's write some stuff down on this whiteboard and see if we can get people to agree to it. Because before that, in the conversation, they were just talking in circles, as can frequently happen at small peer conferences. So I think that the manifesto ends up being this artifact that became a galvanizing, a catalyst, but a galvanizing artifact, a catalyst to massive changes in the industry. And I don't think we need to go back and revise it. I do think that as we go forward, that doesn't mean we don't change. When you look at the evolution of Agile, extreme programming, Scrum, SAFe, etc. There's all of these practices or sets of processes, methodologies that got distilled out, written about, nice little book, packaged up, put a bow on it. And I can imagine a world where there's adding more about exactly how to go about testing in various ways. There is plenty of room for innovation, for discovery. There have been some wonderful things written. I am a huge fan of Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory's work on Agile testing. So it's not that I'm saying no because I think we've achieved the end state. That's not true at all. It's more like I just don't feel a need to go back and revise that document from 2001 when it was published.
Awesome. This is a pet peeve of mine, but I'm curious to know what you think. Manny says, question, automated testing or automated checking?
Oh, could we please just stop?
I get agita just thinking of this anyway.
Yeah, no, okay. But this is a talk about history. So let me tell you some history. The whole debate about testing versus checking came out of just a handful of key members of the context-driven school of software testing. Now, I had my own take that I actually had kind of developed my own take in parallel that I wrote about in Explore It. And I actually somewhere deep in the archives have a time date stamped tweet that predates the articles that started coming out on testing versus checking, where I said I realized that testing is checked and explored. So that's my personal take on it. But ultimately, I think what matters more is that we do it well than that we continue to debate whether it's testing or checking.
Absolutely. And so, Elisabeth, those are all the questions we have time for, but I want to leave off with a comment that someone just put in here, but I just lost it. It was from Patricia. I think she sums it up really well. Where'd it go? Give me 1 second. I wish I could freeze the chat from moving so much.
Technology, right?
Yeah, really. Here it is. I lost it again. So she just said it's really inspiring, this talk, especially from a woman in IT. It was well put. It really gave her perspective and really inspired her. And I think it inspired all of us. And I just want to thank you for all your contributions to the community over the years. I personally, you've been on my bucket list forever to talk to, so I get to cross this off as well. So thank you so much. Any parting words of wisdom you want to leave RoboCon, though, before we go?
Oh, goodness gravy. I don't have much wisdom, so I don't have words of wisdom, but I will be hanging out in the Gather Town space, I think on the dark side, if I have figured out the map correctly, cool. If anybody wants to chat.
Thank you so much again. It's been a true honor, so thank you so much, Elisabeth, for your time. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Talk to you later. Cheers.